Welcome to the session of mapping the University of Samples. As you have here, the session is recorded, but I guess you know that. From the sample type classification working group. And here's a list, the names of the speakers, so myself, and then we will have David Elbert, Thomas Rose, Catherine Ryan, and Leslie Weiborn. She is in the parallel session, but she promised to switch to this session in time. Oops. And of course, also a welcome to new RDA members. And let me remind you of the 6 guiding principles of the RDA community, which is openness, consensus, inclusivity, harmonization, community-driven, and non-profit and technology neutral. I want to start with a little bit setting the frame what our working group is about. In science, lots of data is collected from samples, and that means that you would need some description of the sample in your data in order to make this data fair. And so there is generic bibliographic metadata is useful for discovery and citation, but not sufficient to understand the subject of the measurement. But it is challenging to have a proper metadata standard to describe the samples. So that is the basic problem. And most importantly, what we have in our data is a huge variety of samples. I won't read out that list, but you see that yourself. The important point is, given that huge variety, it is mostly impossible to have one common metadata standard to describe all those samples. And so then that makes it difficult to have a proper sample description in the data. And so the approach that we were thinking that we would need is we would need at least vocabulary for the top-level classification of the sample types. The idea is, once you know that something is a battery, then you can apply battery vocabularies to describe it. So you would need to know what it is in order to know that you can apply domain-specific metadata standards. And of course, we would want to have this classification vocabulary to be standard and across all domains. So that means we would need a classification vocabulary that must be very broad, because it must be applicable to all kinds of samples. But at the same time, it can be very shallow, because we don't want to go into the detailed description of the samples. That can be left to domain-specific vocabularies. And so that is exactly the task of this sample type classification working group. We want to develop as a goal one or more global cross-domain classification vocabularies for sample types, and in order to connect all the domain-specific vocabularies. And so the status of the group is we had our kickoff meeting in the last plenary in Brisbane, and now we have like almost half a year existence of that group since then, and in this session we want the most important subject of the session is to present the first, say, activities of that working group, and that is we collected community input. And Catherine will present that of what we gathered so far. But before we going into that, we will have two contributions for, say, practical examples of samples in different communities. So we have David Elbert, who will present samples in material science. We have Thomas Rose, who will present the metadata profile from the IGSN archaeological community of practice. After that, we have then the presentation of the case studies by the presentation will be done by Catherine, and then a discussion from all. And then we will have Leslie Weiborn, who will tell us about the activity of the neighboring groups, the physical samples interest groups. They did a collection of metadata profiles and vocabularies, and she will present that, and we will see what of that can be used in our working group. And once again, the QR code of the collaborative notes, so you can say inscribe yourself in there and hopefully take some notes. And that was already, say, my short introduction. And with that, I hand over the screen to David.
Thank you, Rolf. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I will hide two windows. You should now see my slides, which are now, for me, in full screen mode. Yeah?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, great. So, yeah, I'm going to talk about material science. For those who don't really know material science, here in orange, you can see a simplified definition. It's about materials, things that we make things from, and the goal to try to discover new ones or design them for certain properties that are of interest to us. And there are a great number of these. Rolf mentioned we've been collecting these community studies, and Catherine's going to go through much more of those. But I thought for the materials one, the things that I had contributed on that, I would just abstract here a little bit. So the first thing I want to emphasize is that these are, of course, made things, not collected things, or already we have some differences from some other domains. And they are really any kind of material that you can think of: metals, alloys, ceramics, polymers, composites, semiconductors, biomaterials, quantum, electronic materials, and so on. But the part that is kind of interesting when thinking about putting these things into lumps is that the history in material science is such that we might name these based on what they're made of, metal, alloy, ceramic, or how they are used in some certain case as a semiconductor, perhaps, or an energy material, or by important properties of those materials, like that they do semiconduct or they have the ability to elicit and store multiple states and quantum materials and the like. So already we have some complexity just from that. We're really interested in material science in terms of the structure across many scales, from the atomic up through grain scale things, and how that structure can be controlled when we make the material, when we do what's called processing. This is why you would temper steel to make a steel that would hold a sharp edge, for instance. And then defects are very important. That may affect why the electronic or optical properties are the way they were, or the way they are. We're obviously very interested in physical properties, how strong something is under tension or under fatigue, and then these special types of properties, you might think of them. So I made a list of the kinds of characterizations that we do, and the highlights are just these yellows are sort of all different types of microscopy, anything you can think of, different types of spectroscopies in blue, different types of scattering data, perhaps in green. And these are all sort of more specialized things like measuring electrical measurements or porosity or doing tomography on things. So we really sort of have to connect samples to all these different types of things, and the diversity of material science is quite large. We also tried to gather information about existing vocabularies and metadata standards. And I just highlighted a few here to make another point that I think is a general point that's important when we try to figure out this top level vocabulary, which is that we really sort of have two approaches. Either we have quite comprehensive things like this first link is an ASTM standard F3490 for additive manufacturing. Additive manufacturing is essentially a glorified name for 3D printing in a variety of different ways that you might do it, either in plastics or metals or ceramics or other things. Um, this is an incredibly hard job to do. There's a common data dictionary now. The community has worked very hard on this. But the problem with this is there are 3,260 metadata fields in this common data dictionary, which means that it's almost impossible to use. No one has that much metadata, of course, but just thinking about putting together something for a given project or across a series of projects, just understanding what the options here might be, and it's put together by a committee, and I don't mean to denigrate anyone on the committee, but there are lots of times when you walk through this and you see a few things and you think, what's the difference between these things? Aren't these the same types of things? So there are practical problems in having this large approach. And Rolf mentioned the importance of linking things. And what we do in the projects that I run actually are to have smaller JSON schemas, and then we link those together. And for us, then, a huge motivator is that the sample is the golden piece that everything links back to, and provides a full history of things. So the really exciting thing that has motivated this strongly for me is this change to autonomous research and trying to develop what are sometimes called laboratories of the future or self-driving laboratories. The same thing happens in digital twins, models of physical objects, where we now piece together multiple things into a complex digital twin, and we want it also to be autonomous. So this really, there are a number of things that it does. It is hugely transformative at this point, but the last line is the one I wanted to emphasize, which is that samples are the anchor to being able to link things across all of this autonomy. In fact, there are many beautiful self-driving labs or programmable cloud labs, and people routinely can't figure out how to link the data together without making it a sort of bipartite connection between those things. So it has changed really fast. I gave a talk and I 2025 is not 2023. Well, of course, 2026 is really not 2023. And this changes how we think about things. Just a couple of years ago, in my own work, when we were making FAIR data, we were doing things like curating static data sets, minting DOIs, so a paper would come out, there'd be a data availability statement, there'd be a landing page with the data. Hopefully we had an interoperable format for it. And this is still critically important work, and it's not like it's a solved problem that happens magically. But I think that we're really looking much more in a forward-looking way now. So this is a movie of the self-driving laboratory, that part of it that we have at Hopkins. So what you're looking at is the robot is grabbing a sample now. There's a little track on the bottom you can see that carries samples around. The machine you're seeing two views of is a big X-ray machine. This is somewhat between a standard laboratory X-ray diffractometer and what you could do at a synchrotron. The fluxes are very high, and we have a large 2D detector. The robot will then take that sample and place it into the chamber. You've got a camera inside the chamber. That's my favorite part of the video, where you can see it come through the door like that. Then the door will close, and inside the chamber, a robot will go ahead and pick that sample up and put it in front of the beam. And while it's doing that, I'll show you down here with my cursor. This is where the X-rays will come. This is a metal jet liquid gallium source, so quite high. There's an Eiger 2D detector here. And you'll every now and then see the robot move as it lays in points across the sample. But now you'll see that in the data portal, we're live streaming this data. It comes as H5, that's a version of HDF5, in a master file. And already you're seeing that these things have been reduced, and other files are popping up because we're automating workflows here. So we live stream the data, we process the live stream data. We actually have to slow it down for the video. You'll see we get images of the detector out of the H5, and we have integrated the 2D into a 1D CSV and then plotted it and so on and so forth. And so these are really critical to feeding data in a live sense to any sort of a AI decision maker. We can't have students do this type of work anymore. We have to do this much, much more quickly. And when the sample is done, the robot picks it out, sends it back out the door to the other robot, and of course, then off we go with the next sample. And I think for this group, if I've timed my speaking correctly, we're just about to the point where the robot will take it out. And then you'll see that the metadata also pops up, right? So now we not only know exactly where we have done all of this, and I'm going to show you that we know everything about that sample all linked together by having this type of system. But we also have now controlled the provenance of all that data. So we actually have all the, oh, why does it not show? Maybe I missed it. Oh, it's not here on this slide, but you would see, if I did it correctly, all the metadata also. So this used to take 2 hours per data point a couple of years ago, maybe 1 hour on a traditional type of detector. Now we can do, in just 2 years later, 10 seconds per data point. We actually could do 1,000 of these things in under 8 hours now, right? So it's now up to sort of synchrotron speed. And so we need ways to handle this data. We need to link everything in an automated way quickly. Ah, there's the metadata. And we have everything about the version of the software. I just needed to click. So let me very quickly jump out of the slides and into, he said, trying to jump out of the slides without leaving the Zoom entirely. Show you what happens in the data portal then. So we control these by, we are using a modification of IGSMs. And so now using related identifiers, all the raw data as it is collected is curated, is linked back to all the other data. So here's how that sample was actually made. This is a vacuum arc melting synthesis. So we have all that data all linked up with all the rest of the data, small punch tests, split Hopkinson bar compression tests, X-ray diffraction, and EBSD. And it all happens automatically because it comes through the sample. And what's sort of extra exciting about that is, of course, now it's a DOI. So we have it available on DataCite Commons. We can click on the DOI and we see the work and we see who did the work. We can go back to the landing page. It's very important in material science, however, that everybody doesn't have access to the data or even to the metadata. So I've now jumped into a different browser where I'm not logged in. That exact same landing page looks like this. It has what I refer to as thin metadata, the basic descriptions to satisfy what's agreed upon at DataCite. But if you pass the ACLs, you get the full metadata on the same landing page. So I'll wrap it up by going back to the slide and just showing this conclusion, which is that from the materials perspective, there's a really complex history to sample characterization and related names, but the connections starting at the sample really make the provenance that is critical to AI and drives a lot of what we do now. The machine actionability that we can get by using related identifiers through PIDs is foundational. We need to respect ACLs for data. And so I think those of us doing fair data have to think about who controls that. And of course, for us, PIDs are fundamental. So I'll stop there and pass it off to Thomas, who's going to speak in somewhat more detail about one community.
Yeah, thank you, David. And we can pass over to Thomas. I guess we will take questions to the end. Thomas, I don't hear you.
Yeah, you're muted, Thomas.
All right, thank you. So the community of practice jointly driven by IGSN and DataCite, supervised by or overseen by Jens Klum from the IGSN e.V. and by Rory Edmonds until the end of last year for DataCite. And we are now in the process after publishing the metadata profile. I will present in a couple of minutes to see how we move on with our work, how we organize ourselves. Rory was really the pillar on getting the work done and keeping us all on track. And at the moment, we have to distribute the tasks he did in the past. So the DataCite community of practice, or IGSN community of practice, was basically comprising of archaeologists with a very diverse background. I myself are from archaeometry. We have others from landscape archaeology and also from national repositories for archaeological materials and data management. And we all are joined together by our interest in material sample management, in data collection, and in publication of this information. At the moment, we are 13 members and we meet monthly. And the primary goals of the community of practice was to promote PID use for archaeological samples, which then means, of course, IGSN identifiers, and to articulate use cases and workflows within the different disciplines. And with the disciplines, I don't mean here archaeology compared to material science, but mostly within archaeology, which is a huge field itself. So, and part of it is then to describe the samples in terms of a minimum and an extended metadata profile. In the interest of time, I will show you the minimum, the very top level one, and if you follow the links I will share here in the slides, then you will get the full metadata profile. The challenges we have in archaeology are very similar to the ones in material science we just saw. We have diverse use cases and also diverse practices. We have a huge range of different materials, metals, ceramics, biological materials, aDNA extracted from soils and other biomarkers. Pretty much everything which was left behind by humans or humans interacted with at some point in time is researched by archaeologists and related disciplines, and this also is reflected in the range of methods we are using. The most important part for us is, of course, apart from describing the material we are sampling, also to record the provenance, and then another important aspect is access. Like there are aspects in material science where you don't want to make the metadata available. For us, it's very strongly related to, for instance, looting of sites, that we don't want to give away the exact geo-coordinates of the site the sample was found, for example. So we published the metadata profile. I put the link in the chat afterwards. You can follow it there. There is a web page and hosted by IGSN. The archived version as PDFs is also available through Zenodo. And in parallel with it, we published the crossword recommendations, where we do a mapping from the DataCite metadata schema to the IGSN community of practice metadata profile for archaeological samples, and the other way around. We started already, and we will continue to promote this through, in our case so far, sessions at the EAA and at the EAC. We have to think about how to promote it further. With me now being in the US, there's also a good opportunity to bridge the Atlantic and continue promoting activities in the archaeological communities here in the Americas. And we already had the idea when we were working on the metadata profile that to make it closer to the reality, that we actually should split it up into a profile specific for the sites and the metadata related to the actual site the sample was found, and to the sample in the actual case of a sample. At the moment, both is together to have one coherent profile. So let's walk you through the top level features or properties we have here. I will show you in the next slide, always on the left, on the right part of the presentation, the mapping towards the DataCite metadata profile. The ones in blue are the ones which are related to the site and not to the sample itself. These are the ones we are probably picking out and having a separate metadata profile in the future. If you see something underlined, this means that this property is using a controlled vocabulary or a kind of a terminology, thesaurus, and so on. So first of all, there's project. Project also means site. We decided to name it project because there might be materials where the site is not known, or where are where it was produced without a proper site when we think about experimental archaeology, for instance. So project was the more generic term here, but this includes also, for instance, geocoordinates and other materials. M means mandatory, R means recommended. And if there is an O in the list, then it means optional. Investigation type are different types of archaeological investigations, excavation, surveys, and these kind of things. And then also when this investigation took place, as the dates from to, and the end date can be open because their excavations might be ongoing. Then who collected actually the materials, so the excavator or excavators can be more than one. Then the publisher who contributed to the research itself, and then the title of the sample. So this is quite closely related. We have the description, subject, the dates, the creator and the contributor, and so on, and title as something to refer to. And the next then the next following is the description, kind of an abstract about the sample, some keywords to characterize the sample. If there are other identifiers, like for instance catalog numbers, identifiers from the excavation, or in local authority records, when the sample was actually collected. So this is the date of the sample. The other ones were tied to the investigation dates, which can be much broader. And how it was collected. Was it taken by, for instance, drilling an archaeological object? If we think about samples for material analyses, if it's a pottery fragment which was collected from the soil as it is. Stratigraphic context, so we know a bit more about how deep it was in the earth and which layer, which quadrant, which trench, whatever classification, or not classification, but more like site systematics was employed in the site, and there are different systems to this. Then how deep the sample was is in the stratigraphic context. So we have an idea about, was it at the very top end of it, or was it quite low in the bottom, which might be important when we think about erosion processes, post-depositional alterations, these kind of things. And you see that a lot of them are mapped towards description because there is no real vocabulary available yet, and there is also too much of a variety that we were able to capture it in vocabularies without having another very extensive effort in making this work. And then we continue, and we discussed a long time, but we decided that sample weight is important, and this not only includes the weight in grams, but also a bit of information if the sample was weighed with soil adhering, if it was fresh from the soil, meaning that it still contains some water, which might evaporate over time. The material type is important for us to search. Then the same with the color, some information how the color was taken. Was it measured by eye? Was, for instance, the Manso soil color chart used, or some other kind of system? And also which part of the object the color refers to, because an object can have multiple colors. The dating as absolute dating when we think about radiocarbon dating, so calendar years, and the relative dating when we think about cultural entities, like for instance the Bronze Age, which can mean very different things in absolute ages depending on where you are on the globe. Some more generic keywords to include information not included elsewhere, the current status, how it is available in an archive, if it is available for research, if it's not, if it's maybe lost even. We have some older samples which we have records, but not the sample anymore. And then additional relations to other identifiers and other research output like publications. So that's it. There are some question marks for the optional information because the mapping at the moment is restricted to the mandatory and recommended properties, but not to the optional properties. And that's it from my side. So I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. Are there any, say, burning questions to say examples? I don't see that, then can just proceed. Catherine will now present us So we did an exercise to collect information from much more people tell us about their samples, and Catherine will present that activity and what we learned so far.
Okay, hopefully you can now see
Yep.
my slides and obviously hear me. So I'm presenting an overview of the case studies we've had provided to us so far. So obviously, as Rolf discussed at the beginning, we are trying to build a high-level classification for samples. I'm not going to go over this one in detail because I think we have covered this, but if anyone comes back to this later and wants a reminder, this is what we're working towards. And our first step is to collect case studies. I will say, whilst we're reporting on where we are with this, this is ongoing. And throughout the life of this working group, we will absolutely have a use for any further case studies. So if anyone has any information or knows anyone else who could contribute towards this, anyone working with anything that is being measured, can help us by providing some fairly straightforward information. And there's the link and the QR code are here, and obviously these slides will be available after today's session as well. So we've had responses from a number of domains, concentrated in certain areas, and we have a reasonable amount of geology, earth sciences, environmental domains, and a certain amount from material sciences, with a couple of others scattered in there as well. I think there's been a little more activity in the last couple of days, but I've not had a chance to look at that yet, but this gives us an overview of where we stand. From those domains, we have now a list, an idea of the sorts of samples people are collecting within those. As you would expect, these are quite diverse, depending on exactly what is being looked at, and covers most things you could think of, and then some, and then more. So this is giving us an idea of just what is out there and the full range of what we're looking at. So what's probably more important for us moving forward is the properties. So we asked people, how do they describe their samples? What are the properties of their samples? Some terms come up time and time again. If the terminology used is slightly different, when people start giving examples, they're clearly talking about the same idea. So we have things like the physical state. Is this a liquid? Is it a powder? What physically have you actually got? The physical parameters, how big is this thing? How old is it? How heavy is it? Then we have treatments. How was this processed prior to being tested? How was the sample perhaps broken off from a parent sample? What has happened to this that we know about since it was either created or discovered? We had the location that the object is from. Like I said, there's a lot of earth and environmental sciences and archaeology, which obviously are looking at geographical areas, sometimes with specific coordinates, sometimes more a generalization of what type of environment was being studied. But for created samples, as David was talking about earlier, that might be which lab created the sample, which supplier provided the components, or even the complete sample as well. A number of people mentioned the personnel, who are the main people connected with this sample. And many of the domains have some form of fairly high level classification in place. We're obviously looking to do something above that, but this may be a useful way to split out samples if, for example, a sample can be described using a biological taxonomy, so species, genus, that kind of thing, then they may well all be described with similar metadata. Obviously, there'll be variation, but a lot of what we're looking at here is how can we describe samples in a similar way to form our classifications, and that may be something to look at. We then had properties that were common across several different domains, but not across everything. So I've given a few examples here of material science. The several different branches of material science are looking at things like the magnetic state of the material. Temperature becomes more critical than it is for a lot of other areas. And obviously the biological sciences, if you're looking at something that is or was at some point a living organism, there's a whole load of descriptors there that wouldn't make sense for other domains. But they are not confined to just one community. And then we have the more domain-specific properties. So these are things that are mentioned once and are clearly very specific to the domain that they were mentioned in, and don't really have an obvious parallel in the other areas. That we may find this very helpful. These may be the more useful properties to help split out what we're looking at and work out where some of the divisions are. But this is certainly an area that we need a lot more information and may need to go back and see if these properties can be weighted in some way for how important they are for distinguishing samples. We asked about any existing vocabularies and standards. Now, this was very dependent on the scientific field in question. Some had many standardized terminologies already in place. We have a lot of links to a lot of websites that are hosting these. And clearly a lot of standard terms are already in use. For what we have so far in the material sciences, there were some vocabularies mentioned, but it was much more limited in scope. Only a few properties had controlled vocabularies of any sort, and there were very few standards being applied in a general term. And some of the other domains that have responded simply said that they didn't use any or were not aware of any. This may mean that these vocabularies have not been developed, or it is possible that there is someone out there working on it, but it's not been widely adopted yet, so that the people responding to us are not routinely using them. What we did see is that there's very little crossover. Even very closely related fields don't seem to be using the same vocabularies. It is very specific to the domains. And they seem to, so far from what we've seen, vocabularies stay within their own domains. The services that are hosting these, some of them are generic vocabulary hosting services, but there seems to be a trend that they host a lot that belong to certain domains and very little from what we've had supplied to us from outside of that. So it is certainly one to be aware of that. If you miss a vocabulary service, you may be missing vocabularies for everything for a particular domain, and there may not be a lot of crossover. But we can see, and from the longer responses people have given, that this area is expanding extremely rapidly. And a number of the vocabularies submitted are under development currently. I mean, yes, this is an ongoing process, but this is clearly their initial development, and they're still growing at the beginning of their lifetimes, or they have only been very recently developed and are being adopted There are some notable exceptions to this, but this is the general trend is that the vocabularies are on the newer side. We asked about persistent identifiers. Now, of 13 responses at the time that I was putting this together, 10 said they don't use any PIDs. Now, from a data management point of view, this is far from ideal. Of the 3 that did say they use some PIDs, the only ones that were identified were IGSN to keep track of the samples, ORCID to identify any personnel attached to the samples, and RAW, which gives a PID for institutes involved in the process. So this very much seems like we have some pieces missing. This is not the focus of this group, this working group, but it is an area that we need to keep an eye on and see if anything is coming up, or if this is helpful for us, that if we can encourage, obviously if we encourage further use of these specific PIDs, that is helpful and everyone's working in the same direction. But it does mean that there's an awful lot of domains out there, an awful lot of samples that have no global identifiers attached to them. And that brings us to our discussion. We need to work out where we are going next from here and start forming our own vocabulary, or at least the bones of it, to move forwards. So we would like to open the floor up for discussion on what happens next.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. And exactly that is what we should give some time for discussion of that case study collections. Are there any questions or comments on to that?
There was one in the chat. Xian Yong.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I was playing with the light. It's so bad. It looked like a ghost when I turn it on. Anyway, hi David. I met him at Colorado actually doing the pit instrument pittance thing. So this is a fascinating. I'm deeply involved in CCO, complex citation object implementation group, and I was just struggling with the case where they can use it, and this seems like a perfect case. Like when you guys, work on a study where a lot of samples involved, and then let's say you assign IGSNs and you want to include it in your paper, but there's a limitation about how many, I don't know where you can even put it in. It's in the method section. You can't put all of them. So you need to kind of wrap it as a container. And CCO might give you that opportunity in a way, because they're trying to assign PID. Right now, we're considering DOI. And they put it in a method section and also in data availability section and reference section. So I see a lot of kind of overlapping scenario here, synergistic effort we could. I just, have you heard of it? Have you talked to, I'm sure David talked to Shelley about this. What do you think?
How's that? I mean, I was in the complex citation object session
okay.
earlier today, but it is sort of my first real exposure to the area, which I find it's all very interesting, and it definitely is something that should make a big difference going forward.
Yes.
So that seems great. Once we have our classification, it may be that gives us a way to build complex citation objects, or I appreciate the groups working on being renamed, but
Right. So they do have they had like a technical test group. They divided into 3 test groups: a technical test group, implementation test group, and now they're about to work on adoption test group. So it's within the CCL, individual component is called LDO, linked, object, linked digital object. So IGSN is going to be LDO, for example, but they can use a PID, they can use just a website URL. They haven't completely defined yet, but this would be a great example. I really think they're looking for case studies, and definitely, RDA workgroup IG always look for adoption. That's the ultimate goal. So, I think we definitely I invite you to join the group and kind of bring together, because they're about to launch adoption test group, and I would love to have someone representing from this group, because I see a perfect. Oh, there's a Leslie. Leslie, she is actually a part of the complex citation group. Don't you agree? This is like a perfect example for CCL implementation, soon to be RDO,
I've
RCL.
just joined in because I'm actually co-chairing another session, and now I've switched to this one. Are you saying for samples, because physical samples should be a case study in complex citations?
Yes.
Yeah, it already is there. It was led by Joan Damerow of the Department of Energy, and she's moved on, and we're just sort of trying to get that going again with, say, the ESIP physical samples cluster. Because, this complex citations for samples is what's needed for sure.
How do you guys
Any
capture this when you publish a paper in the past? How do you capture them?
It's just usually if, and again, I'm speaking from IGSN, it's just a massive text list or Excel spreadsheet in a supplement. Okay, and once you put things in supplements to journals, then the automatic indexes like Scholix and that can't pick it up. They only work off the bibliographic section of the paper. Okay, and typically, I know myself, I've often had a paper that's been an analysis of 2,000 samples, and that's just not been feasible.
Yes, I think
any
that this could turn it into CCO easily. Then you have a PID associated with the entire collection of IGSNs used for the study.
Anyway, I hate to interrupt, but are there also, say, questions around the vocabularies and the collection of case studies?
I have a question about the use of PIDs there. You said you were surprised that there are so few. I mean, the other kind of PIDs I could imagine are PIDs for vocabularies, for the terms in a vocabulary or in a thesaurus. What kind of other PIDs would you have expected to describe physical samples?
I don't know if it was the variety that particularly, or the lack of variety that particularly surprised me. It was the fact that so few people were using any at all. I said that the vast majority simply wrote none under PIDs. So they're not using IGSN or DataCite. They're either not identifying people with ORCIDs, or they didn't necessarily see how that was relevant to a sample. That's a possibility as well. But in terms of if you have a sample, if it's a manufactured sample, are manufacturing techniques identified in some consistent way? I said whether or not that would be a PID, I don't know. If you're collecting something geographically, do you have presumably we have marine scientists, so they're working off ships, so the ships have identifiers. There was just so little that was mentioned. I'm not saying all of it is relevant to us, but the fact there were so few of anything mentioned at all, and that most people who responded haven't mentioned any PIDs at all.
Well, okay. Well, then I should update the archaeological ones as well, because, for instance, I didn't thought about geo names, because it's not about a sample, it's about the site. And
Well, yeah, and I appreciate that. Yeah, there will be things like this that aren't that people won't have provided because they're not necessarily immediately relevant. But as I said, it was so few people were using any sort of persistent identifiers, or at least any that they felt worth mentioning at any rate. So.
Leslie.
I'll just add, in Australia, Digital Science has done a review for ARDC on the use of PIDs in Australia, and IGSN, which is a sample one, got called out because it's working independently of the PID graph. And part of that is because people are not using ORCIDs and RAWs. And my defense of that is they're not using it because we started our metadata schemas 20 years ago before ORCIDs and RAWs were in existence. So as part of a review in our sample metadata now, we're looking to see, well, don't just name the person, we want the ORCID. Don't name the organisation, we want the RAW. So it's a bit of a retrospective. I'll hand over to David.
Yeah, I was going to piggyback on those things and say that in my own case, we in fact use those other PIDs, but I just went as far as the sample, the thing that I start from and that I link to, but we do in fact identify all the people with ORCIDs. We do use DOIs for PID-INST for our instruments, and we are now actually on the sandbox at ORCID pushing, which kind of comes back to the complex citation issue. We're pushing data now. We will push data to production soon on every sample that is run that you saw that starts our graph off to all those actual metadata schemas, metadata collections, and then raw data will go to a person's resource record on ORCID. So, the thought being that that will allow a variety of things to happen. It's a record of it. Also, it allows publishers to actually validate that somebody collected data in the laboratory for which they're now publishing and that sort of thing. So they were excited about that. But so far that happens to my knowledge, by supercomputing resources from the National Science Foundation in the US, what's called Access. Happens from one national lab in the US, I think, maybe two, Oak Ridge National Lab and maybe one other. And we'll be the first sort of smaller lab to do that. So right now, a lot isn't being gathered on the back end of that. But once we start pushing thousands of samples to somebody's ORCID record, it's a different kind of problem of what Xianyang was talking about in a publication as well. So, but we sort of think of, from the person's standpoint, the ORCID being the starting point as the aggregator of everything. But from our standpoint in the science, the sample being, so we do link to those. So maybe that people didn't think of them.
So I have a question about IGSN. I'm not totally familiar with IGSN. I don't use that much. When you created, do you put like a creator, which you can link to ORCID, and then where, like you can link it to affiliation ROR or something like that? So you have all
okay, so I work with IGSN. The minimum profile does have a creator or collector. It does have organization, but at the moment they don't we're going to change it, but it's going to have to be specifying ORCID and RAW.
But to be clear, an IGSN is a data site DOI. So you have
that's
that
right.
same schema available to you, but just like for a publication, if somebody doesn't have an ORCID, you just list their name and affiliation. So you can still do that as well with one.
Yeah.
So it's not mandatory either.
With an IGSN, the thing that to get it is you have to have that basic 6 elements, 4 of which are compulsory for the data site registration metadata. Yeah. Okay, so we've got to fix that.
So IGSN is like a custom DOI, specifically for that type, sample.
It used to be a custom DOI in its own right, and it was run by a group of volunteers and was too much. So what we did was we still have the IGSN organization, but the back end and the minting of the DOIs and everything is done through a partnership with DataCite. similar to the partnership with Rhodes, similar to Disco, I think is going that direction as well. So what you
Right.
get is technically a DOI,
Right.
but
So there are
the
a lot of
management of it is in another organization.
right. So we do see a lot of custom DOIs and specific for the type. Like IGSN is one of them, DMPID is another one. Even the what is it, RAID is another one. So they start from dataset, metadata schema, but they customize it for certain type. So, but the problem with all these things is that the fields are there, but it's not mandatory fields. So quality of a metadata really varies depending on how much information they put it in, how many PIDs they link to, because by adding PIDs, you make them machine actionables, you connect them together. But if it's not required, it's not a mandatory field, so it's missing oftentimes. So that's why we end up with this insufficient, metadata quality, which makes it a little hard to make it interoperable or, find the provenance, all this stuff. So that's a
I mean,
separate issue.
this is partly what we from HZB at least are trying to address and why we're involved in this group. So IGSN originally was broader, but if you look at the data site requirements, it is very basic data because there's very little that describes every sample. This is why we want to bring in this classification layer. If we can add in that you include a sample type, and this is from a controlled vocabulary, then from that type you can then establish which metadata standards apply to that sample. And certainly for us, we're developing a database for samples that come through our institute. So we're a research institute. People come to us and measure their samples at our facility. And if we can store the types, we can then encourage people to store more detailed metadata based on what that type is. We would then be looking at minting IGSNs to go with that, but to then be able to provide a much richer metadata landscape as people come to the landing page that we would then have for in our data further connected to our database. So that's exactly where we're going with this, or want to go with this, that if we can classify samples at a very high level, that's we see that as the first step towards enriching the metadata for those samples.
Okay, thank you. I guess we should move on, and we would like to hear about from.
Yeah,
okay.
I say just a quick reminder that we are still collecting case studies. We will still be collecting case studies. Please do contribute anything and pass this on to anyone else that you think might be able to help us. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. And with that, I would like to give Leslie the opportunity to report from activities from the physical samples and collections in the research data ecosystem interest group.
Okay.
Leslie, are you able to run your slides, or?
I'm just going to try. Can you see them?
Yeah.
I just have to get it into slideshow mode.
Yeah.
There
Just
we
hit the slideshow button.
are.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
All right. So as Rolf announced, our name of our group is quite a mouthful. And I guess I wanted to let you know it started in 2017 in Montreal. But the important thing is that it's about the samples, it's about the collections, and also the ecosystem. So when we develop metadata profiles or look at them for a sample, it's actually the broader context. And we produce this catalog. I'll put a link to the catalog in the notes if you want to click on it, or someone can put it's in the notes and someone can put it in the chat. And also just letting you know we're having a session in about another 14 hours on reviewing what we've come up with this catalogue. So if I can go to the next slide, as I said, we're not focused on samples, and we recognise there's an urgent need for better integrating into the digital research ecosystem, both in a global and in an interdisciplinary group to support search, retrieval, analysis, and reproducibility. And when I thought about the context, I've just thrown a few examples. So the top one is the sensor observation samples and actuators, but the actual sample itself, or the sampling procedure, is just one of a myriad of attributes that people collect when they collect a sample. And then also down the bottom here, we've got what they're calling the universal model from Darwin, sorry, from GBIF, noting that their emphasis is more on the focus of the event, which may or may not have a sample, whereas with the field, with work I do, or even laboratory work, the critical point is the sample itself. That's the focus, not so much the time you collected it. So again, it's kind of understanding these different ecosystems that people have built around sampling events. And then, of course, as in material science and even in geochemistry, you've got to deal with the we call it manufactured samples, rather than the ones from the real world, which have a lot of attributes related to field collection, time, location, indigenous attributes, was it collected under the care principles, etc. So if I can move to the next one, the catalogue, which I hope you've all opened, was just started around 2023. And we only had the first sheet going, and it needs to be cleaned up. But we've got 42 groups that we know of that are working on samples. So please feel free, if your group's not there, to add it. We started the second worksheet after EGU in Vienna last year, because the IGSN EV has started a metadata working group, and I'll deal with that later. But we thought, oh, let's go and see what's out there. And that sheet has just grown organically, and there are now 53 entries. And every time we have an RDA plenary meeting or other meetings, we just show it to people and say, you know, please add your vocabulary, metadata schema, ontology, whatever semantic resource you've got, can you please add it to this catalogue? So I'm giving you the background on how we started this catalogue. And as I said, the initial aim was as I said earlier, you've got the IGSN registration metadata, full stop, and they're the mandatory. And then what we thought in IGSN EV was, well, let's have a descriptive common kernel related to samples. But as IGSN, it originally started in the Earth Environmental Science group, broadened out. It's now got people from archaeology, materials science, God knows what's getting in there now. We then thought, well, hang on, let's just do a survey of metadata schemas or samples. And I honestly thought we get maybe 10 to 15. Well, we've now got 55, I think, are on the list. I just checked before I came in. And as I said, we're overwhelmed by the response. And do we need to move to a registry to start storing these? That's can we use AI to harmonise them? But I think then doing some more research for this meeting, I went back to the for the presentation I'm giving tonight at the other group. We need to think about our schemas being as part of a digital ecosystem. And many of the resources listed in our catalogue have metadata that goes way beyond the actual sample itself. Like, for example, I looked at one, it's an Excel workbook that you download, and there's about, I think, 15 worksheets. And so just pausing many of the vocabularies that are on that list are actually used by existing sample repositories that are public available. Okay, so these sample systems are available. The vocabularies are very restricted. And if you want that data set to comply with FAIR, we really need to get these existing vocabularies published somewhere, because a FAIR data set compliance, the vocabularies used to describe the data metadata are themselves FAIR and available. And most of the ones, if you look on that list, they're just going to private Google folders or all sorts of non-permanent things. So that's current situation, but moving forward, we need to look at that list and describe how extensive they are. So on the right, I've got the metadata elements that are set up for the most recent version of ISO 191156 in 2023, which is the model for describing samples. Or again, to make it even more high level and generic, you've got the iAdopt schema, which again, we can map them to. So what I'm saying is, it looks like you've got a wealth of lists there, but when you get into them, sorting them out and getting down to where you've got those core metadata elements that describe the sample, I think is important than understanding how many more elements your group is going to go beyond, just that one of those boxes, which is the sample. Another thing that's happening also with our group is that once we're getting into scientific metadata, like methods to collect samples or describe samples, we're starting to connect with the top one is the science unions and associations, etc. Like, for example, I know the International Union of Soil Sciences is setting up a partnership with CoData to get something formally decided on, sample metadata, as well as, bringing in the scientists from the Science Union to make sure that what they're doing is so that we can endorse it. So what I'm saying is that if you look at our catalogue, you'll see there are a lot on the same themes or domains. And we feel that to get the authoritative endorsement of which ones should be the ones that we work on and go forward, we need to find some mechanism of engaging with the scientists. And then, of course, I've also got some projects listed that don't necessarily connect to a science union, but particularly like GBIF is very active, OBIS is getting active. And then above all, you've got this CoData World Fair project, which is also looking at critical elements of disciplinary descriptions of samples. So I guess what I'm saying is we're sort of in a state of play trying to work out where we go next, because this list was of 55, whatever it is. We didn't expect that. And so, yeah, we need to consolidate. And then also it'd be good if we could help define within those lists what parts of the metadata elements that everyone's describing are relevant to your exercise. Because I can think of one spreadsheet that honestly they've got about 200 or more elements in it. You'd probably only be interested in 5. So there's it. So again, I've got my slides are in the folder. That's the catalogue. Feel free to join the group, and then the session we're having in whatever it is, 12, 14 hours. Okay, so Ralph, I'll stop sharing my screen and ask if there's any questions anyone wants to ask, or just hand it back to you.
Thank you very much. That was exciting. Are there direct questions to the contribution from Leslie? If that is not the case, I would like to ask you all the audience. So, yeah, coming back to the question from the case studies, how much of the puzzle can we see at the moment? So where do we stand in, say, understanding that universe of samples and how to classify that? Are there, say, impressions, ideas, comments to that? Or David, you're muted.
Thanks. I don't want to stop people who haven't had things to say. I just, this point I've made, I think, before, which is how we do it so that a specific sample can be in more than one category, right? I mean, the idea of having categories is to split things so there's clarity, but people see the same thing differently depending on where they come from or how they're going to actually use the information. So that's a complexity that I don't always see in vocabularies handled in ways that I understand. So I hope it gets worked out.
Yeah, that is an interesting one. Are there comments to that?
I have a question about pittance. If I recall at that meeting, the Colorado meeting, didn't they say it's not a DOI yet? It's just a metadata schema. They're not actually minting the DOI through DataCite. It's just a metadata schema.
I'm sorry, but let's concentrate on samples and not so much on instruments at the moment. Although I'm interested in instruments, but it's not the scope of that session, I mean, maybe a thought to what David just said. I had the impression the sample type is not so much what describes a sample, it's more like how you look at it. I mean, the very same piece of thing could be an archaeological object or could be a rock, depending on what you're investigating in it.
Yeah, agreed. And so, can that very same sample be classified twice? Then, do we allow that? Or does it have a group of terms that are at the same level?
Thomas, do you want to comment?
Thomas has his hand up.
Well, I think that it should be possible to describe it twice, but we should have as the aim, as far as I think, is that we still should be able to connect them together if people are looking for a certain type. So being too strict in the categories will be difficult. But as Rolf said, the context is important. I mean, when we do experimental archaeology and we do smelting, then we are kind of doing material science on a quite of different level, but we are producing metal there, like in other ways as well. So making this distinction will be really tricky and really difficult to come up with a good system where which is not failing so often that people get annoyed. And I found the idea that Catherine made with the material-specific metadata, like the efficiency for solar cells, quite interesting in this regard. But I think in the end, when we capture these, it would mean that the absence or the presence of this information would define which kind of sample we have there.
Vanya, do you want to
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment on what Thomas has just mentioned. So how to handle the problem when you have a sample and you want to sort it to different sample types in a way, and then how to get along with the hierarchy. I mean, you have several parent-child relations, and you've just mentioned this will be tricky, but do you have any plan how to handle this? This is something we have also addressed in our use case. We have just submitted this morning. So I'm wondering if you have already some plans how to handle.
I mean,
Not yet. Okay. Maybe we can. I don't know if just answer, but I also have one more question apart from
yeah,
this.
go ahead.
Okay, so the other thing is, I mean, we come more or less all from an infrastructure, and we have the side from the infrastructure. But how about the scientists? How do we get them to use it to adopt this? I mean, they bring their own lists of vocabulary of terms, and then we have to map it to control vocabulary terms, what we find somewhere. But what is your strategy? How they can adapt this?
Well, my hope would be that we are so good that we can team up, for instance, with Electronic Lab notebooks, that they include the
Okay.
vocabularies from scratch and kind of a bit more top-down, forcing researchers to sticking to them.
Okay.
Similarly, as a long-term goal, if we can have it so it becomes a required field in something like IGSN or something where people are recording their samples. But I think both of your questions are focusing on implementation. Obviously, we want to build
Yeah.
something that's useful, so it is something we do need to consider. But at the moment, we don't have anything to implement. So once we have a vocabulary, or as we're building it, we need to bear in mind things like, can a sample have more than one category? Are the categories broad enough that that wouldn't be necessary? And that is something we need to bear in mind. But we can't really answer questions about how that will be implemented until we actually have something in front of us. So we're very early in the process, I think, at the moment.
Daniel?
Yeah, I was just about to type something. So in terms of metadata standards or domain-specific standards, control vocabulary you mentioned, it's good to publish it and then, but also create it on fairsharing.org, because that's the biggest database people go to when you look for metadata standards and standards. I was going to just put something in MiFLOWCyt, for example. This is a flow cytometry standards that everyone accepts it. But once they publish it, they make it available so people can kind of follow community accepted metadata standard and standards. So that's something maybe this group can work on. And having a control vocabulary or metadata standard is really critical to make data set or sample, interoperable so that everyone using the same language in a way. So that I was I was trying to kind of lead you to using fairsharing.org for that kind of work.
Leslie?
You're muted, Wes.
Another thing I was going to say that we're thinking of doing in IGSN EV is actually starting to determine which ones are with the local societies and groups, which ones are the preferred vocabularies, and publishing them on a registry somewhere. This is future thinking where, say, if you're doing material science or geoscience, we say this is the community preferred vocabulary or, recommended. But I agree with David, again, the way Jason LD and the schema.org's going, you can take terms from multiple vocabularies. And the critical factor is getting those existing vocabularies into proper vocabulary services, with each term having an ID on it. And that's when I think we'll worry less about, which vocabulary we are using, but more which is the most valid term and where does it come from.
I mean, I guess some of the answers is also I mean, at the moment we are aiming at creating a vocabulary. How it is used, then it also depends on how it is integrated into existing tools. And maybe it's not that researchers use vocabularies directly, but they often use tools, and these tools are built on vocabularies. To give an example, we are at the moment in our institute developing a central sample database. And in that sample database, so if you register a sample, you will be one of the fields that you will fill in would be a sample type, which, assuming that we have developed our vocabulary, will be taken from that controlled list. And based on the selection that people use, then they will be presented with further, say, type-specific metadata fields that they can provide to describe that sample. So in that case, the scientists will use that vocabulary in the way that they will select the sample type from a, say, prescribed list of terms that they can fill in. And then for the problem of, say, the same sample might have multiple types, I guess you should just be pragmatic with that. The users will use that type that describes their current interest in that sample the most. It is not, say, maybe not in objective absolute characterization, but relative characterization depending on what they are, say, looking at the moment. Any more comments, questions?
Following up on this, when we have the domain-specific vocabularies, we can map between them. At least in a SCOS standard, you can say these are equivalent, so we could bridge or solve this problem there and having different views on the same material, on the same sample.
I totally agree with that. That's the thing, that we can do mappings between them. So let's keep it as flexible as we can. Sorry, Petra.
Draw attention there. I have recently heard about using OntoPortal. Not sure whether you have heard about that. It's like a federation of ontologies across various domains, which we could perhaps also try to explore further whether we could use that, because it was developed for data, for describing data, but I believe that many of those would be relevant also for description of samples. So perhaps that would be something that also have a look at how to then federate from the one terms that would be for specific sample. People could then go into that OntoPortal and see all the relevant ontologies and vocabularies that would be then used to further describe the sample, so we don't have to worry about keeping all the collections, because the collections are already there. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I think that would be also quite useful.
Yep.
I'm a bit afraid about the practical implementation there. The researchers I know would never go to the portal and look for the ontologies themselves. You have to provide some kind of tool where they either get a suggestion to look into them, like do you think about this one or this ontology, and you can browse to them, or you have, like Rolf said, for the database, you have the fields where you have to pick a value from.
I think this was not meant for the researchers themselves. It was rather for the curators of the collections who would have that as a tool, because if they would be minting IGSN, that would be something that they could use to to provide more specific description based on the hierarchy. I don't think that scientists would go. You are right. The scientists would probably not go into that, but I think for the curators it would be a useful tool.
Yeah, David.
Yeah, I was going to say my perspective is that we worry a lot about getting people to adopt, and really the place to do that is through value, right? So people want to go find things and do things with it. And so if we have it well described, then they can do that. They don't even have to really know exactly why that works for them. And then, so for me, it's always been about trying to have it happen, like take advantage of superpowers, like when a large lab like a synchrotron facility adheres to something like this, lots of data goes out like this, and then people want to get that data, or people produce large community data sets that they're going to use for training foundational models, and then people are going to get that. And now I think it's easier than ever because nobody is writing queries, right? They're all using LLMs to go find things for them. And LLMs are bad at some things, many things, but they're good at some things. And so if we have well-registered vocabulary behind something, the LLM will dig into that and it will become the basis of how it presents things. So I think getting it somewhat right and rolling it out on data that has value will solve things now that we couldn't solve 10 years ago or 15 years ago. That's my guess.
Yep. And again, I believe that most vocabularies are used consciously. So people use vocabularies without being aware that this is a particular vocabulary.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. I mean, we only have like 2 minutes left. In principle, we would like to draw conclusions and next steps. I'm afraid we will not manage to do that. Any, say, last comments, questions?
I just added, and I'm a kind of newcomer to this group, so I don't want to, step on anybody's toes, but I'm more familiar with the metadata standards and the data set curation and stuff. Fairsharing.org is a really good tool when you publish, ontology or standards or anything like that. They're really well mapped, connected everything. So they're really good machine to connect all pits and people go there to look for community accepted standards and metadata standards and in all that stuff. So there's an advantage. Once you publish it, have that available on fairsharing.org will increase adoption. And then also it's a map to all kinds of different pits, really well established platform. So just something I would like this group to consider as you move toward, standardizing ontology and, metadata standards and stuff like that. Think.
I was just going to add, obviously, if anyone's not already part of the working group and would like to join us, I've put the link to the homepage in the chat. It should also be in the collaborative notes. If it isn't there yet, it will be in a minute. We have been meeting monthly, and our next meeting is, I think, the 14th of April. And obviously, if you join the group, there will then be the details will be sent out shortly before the meeting.
Yep. Okay. then I guess exactly as Catherine said, on the 14th of April, the next monthly meeting, we definitely will do a debriefing of that current session here. So I'd like to thank you all for your participation.